relatively new in the diocese. I arrived here during the pandemic. Well, sort of as the pandemic was beginning, at the beginning of March, so it's been an interesting first year. I'm the parish priest in Swindon Newtown. In terms of my background as it's relevant to today, years and years ago, I worked in the office of the leader of the opposition as a speechwriter, which was a long time ago. And I've been as a lay person, I was quite heavily involved in politics, locally, a bit nationally as well. For the last 4 years, I've been the parliamentary assistant for the Bishop of Chichester. So it's been interesting seeing things from that point of view too. Anyhow, I shall begin. I think I'm going to talk for a quarter of an hour or so. It's a challenge to know where to begin because the breadth of the areas of public policy touched by the pandemic, as we all know, is really quite staggering. It's much easier to think of fields of policy deeply impacted by COVID than those left untouched. It's affected, for example, housing, social care, international development and cooperation, the arts, intergenerational, racial, social, gender, justice, digital poverty, health inequality, devolution, local government, public finances, welfare, childcare, education, and so on and so on. Given all of that, given what has in the UK been the biggest disruption to our national life since the war, with this massive expansion in the size and the activity of the state, we might feel that the pandemic has changed everything. It's often assumed in the midst or in the aftermath of big events that nothing will be the same again. That was said with 9/11, it was said to an extent with the financial crash, but it's seldom true. If you think of some of those social policy areas, while the pandemic might have shed some light, might have made more newsworthy existing social problems, has it really taught us anything we didn't already know? The demography of the impact of the pandemic in health and in economic terms has been striking, hitting hardest working class, ethnic minority communities, particularly in areas of dense housing. But all of that social inequality and its impact on health outcomes, say with differential life expectancies, what, of more than 10 years between the richest and poorest parts of the city of Bristol, all that we already knew. And of course, depending on the shape of the recovery, depending on the public policy response, we can expect the differential economic impact only to exacerbate those existing inequalities. So I'd argue, first, that the pandemic hasn't really taught us much, and nor does it seem, though it's too early to make good judgments about this, nor does it seem to have shifted social and political attitudes. So the field work for the latest British Social Attitudes Survey was conducted back in July, after the first lockdown was over. And it showed no real shift in public attitudes on key areas like tax and spend, or the generosity of social security, or redistribution through the tax system. So, for example, the numbers disagreeing with the statement, people would learn to stand on their own 2 feet if welfare benefits weren't so generous, that number has remained steady at about 1/3. So it's wrong to assume there's anything automatic about the social and political change that COVID and its aftermath might bring. But the very fact of this disruption surely does open up a space for challenging existing priorities, for challenging old ways of thinking. If there's a desire to build back better, then how does the church, how do we as her members contribute to discussions locally and nationally about what better looks like? So today's entitled COVID and the Common Good. This term, the common good, is used very frequently in Catholic social teaching. It appears, I think, pretty much in every post-Vatican II papal encyclical dealing with political questions. It's an idea rooted in classical political theory, and it's been defined as the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. And the church has generally said that the role of the state is to protect rather than itself to realize the common good. So there's both an implicit rejection of an atomized individualistic worldview, but also of some of those totalitarian ideologies with a centralized vision of the state as the primary agent of human flourishing. So if the church is going to talk about this thing, the common good, at this critical time, what authority does it have to do so? Why should anyone else listen to us? Why particularly should they listen to us speaking as Christians, as members of the church, as distinct from just individual citizens with our own particular personal political instincts and prejudices? I think we can answer that from two angles. First, an internal one, why we think we've got anything worth saying. And secondly, externally, why should anyone else in the public square want to listen? So first, from that internal point of view, from the perspective of faith, the church can speak with confidence on these matters because she is an expert on humanity. That's a term that comes from the Catholic Compendium on the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's quite a grandiose way of putting it, isn't it? But I quite like it because it reminds us that what we say about the common good at this time isn't just to do with philosophy and reason, but it's theological too. What we think about our response to the pandemic, to forming a vision for building back better, on all of that, we bring to those questions inherited wisdom and our ongoing discernment about human nature. What is the vocation of humanity? What gives it dignity and meaning? What are our aspirations and limits? All of this is anthropology with a theological dimension, enlightened by the Holy Scriptures, by our faith. What it is to be human has for us a transcendent dimension. Our neighbours aren't just individuals with rights, but they're made in the living image of God, redeemed by the blood of Jesus, placed under the permanent action of the Holy Spirit. So when we're looking at any particular area of public policy and seeing how it might protect the public good, we need to bring a breadth of vision which sees human development not just as being about economic necessities, but all that gives dignity and meaning to life, the social, the cultural, the spiritual dimensions of human flourishing. So attentive to the scriptures and to our inheritance of faith, we should be able to avoid platitudes and have something distinctive and valuable to contribute. As the compendium puts it, we should be able to speak a word of life that reverberates in the historical and social circumstances of human existence. The second, the external perspective, is all about those particular historic and social circumstances. Even from a purely secular point of view, I think the church can speak with confidence because of her pastoral ministry. The church is deeply rooted in our local communities in a way which no political party, no pressure group is. It has the experience and the practical wisdom that comes through living alongside and having the trust of communities, including many parts of those communities that other political actors find hard to reach. Perhaps we don't always recognize the authority, even in purely secular terms, that this gives us. You know, if you've been helping at a food bank for 20 years, or spending a couple of hours each week in a local residential home, or just being a constant presence in a community when so much else has been stripped away, well, then, of course, you can talk with authenticity and confidence. So from the other side, as it were, having been a parliamentary candidate, trying to get under the skin of a constituency, sitting down to have a cup of tea with and listen to one of the local vicars could be an immensely worthwhile exercise. And I know sort of less churchy friends of mine felt the same. So in practice, when it comes to engaging with this time of political upset and opportunity, I'd make three practical points. First, that we should be confident. I think sometimes we don't realize how ready people are to hear from us. Secondly, that what we say politically, what our sense of the social priorities are as we rebuild after COVID, should be formed by our pastoral experience, if we're to speak with integrity. And thirdly, that we should remember that we can often help give a platform for voices that are unheard on the public square, and there's a particular responsibility I think we have there. Of course, it's not as if the church is just a passive bystander in any of this. It's an integral part of the vocation of a parish church as it proclaims Christ's promise of abundant life to build up the common good. And I'm sure the same applies in chaplaincies and other contexts. There's an excellent essay by the German theologian Karl Rahner, written in the 1980s, entitled "The Theology and Spirituality of Pastoral Work in the Parish." And there he talks about the parish not just being a physical or a geographical reality, but as providing, he says, genuinely neighborly fellowship in righteousness and love, such that this human reality can enter into the Eucharistic celebration. How we respond as a church to the financial challenges of COVID will itself affect the common good and the quality of our political engagement. If the church withdraws pastoral resources, removes resident lay or clerical ministers from communities, then it becomes hard to speak from within those communities. And we can't urge others to have a preference for the poor post-COVID with integrity if we're not showing the same preference ourselves in how we structure and fund ministry. So that's my little contribution to the Transforming Church conversation got in there. The church needs to articulate a vision of human flourishing rather than succumbing to a programmatic approach to policy. I think that's better left to policymakers. But we can still apply some of what I've said to specific public policy challenges post-COVID, and I just want to talk very briefly about a few of those. One which has obviously been very much in the spotlight has been how we treat people in later old age, particularly those living in residential care. Here, the church has a distinctive voice in articulating that later old age and even, I suppose, human frailty is a gift from God and not simply a burden. Our church communities have got those deep-rooted connections with our local care homes and with people living with dementia. Well, I think first, as we approach that policy areas, there is some thanksgiving to be done, because I think we should celebrate the fact that there's been a humane consensus, at least at a national level, that the vaccine should be given to the most vulnerable rather than the most economically productive. And I don't suppose we can take that for granted. On the big questions of how we fund social care and the integration of social care with healthcare, this has been, since at least the late 1990s, like one of those recurring items on a committee's agenda that is just never dealt with. We've had the Sutherland Commission, we've had the Dilnot Commission. There's a consensus that action is needed, but repeatedly, those in power have pulled back from actually implementing a solution. Here, perhaps the role of church communities, maybe not in contributing any sparkling new thinking, but simply in being persistent, to put the feet of policymakers to the fire, to keep telling our MPs that this is an issue that cannot be kicked forever into the long grass. I think we also perhaps have a role to play in widening out the discussion to ensure we don't neglect support for carers in the family, in the community, to ensure we're keeping on the agenda the question of the pay and conditions of those who work in social care, and to be active in supporting local initiatives to break down barriers between generations in the scandal of social isolation and loneliness. A second policy area is one that I might term broadly civic renewal, issues like urban regeneration or housing, or the future of our high streets and social infrastructure. So here in Swindon, in the parish where I serve, which covers most of the town centre, local government's been successful in bidding for Towns Fund money. And on these questions of regeneration, I think all the churches thought about the human dimension to development is relevant here. You know, vision that includes good rest and recreation, self-expression and the arts, green space, accessible public spaces. I don't know if any of you have read Archbishop Justin Welby's book, Reimagining Britain, which was really all about post-Brexit British politics. And one of the things he says on his chapter on housing is that the purpose of housing needs to be understood as creating communities and not merely building accommodation. There's also the whole question of local democracy and local government finance, technical stuff, but without it, it's not going to be possible to restore accountability, participation, and civic pride. And perhaps the church has a role here nationally, rather as the churches in Scotland did with the Constitutional Convention there. Finally, I'm going to raise very briefly, without answering it, the really thorny question of vaccine nationalism. It's ethically such a complex area, and it's hard to make much headway, partly because we don't have all the facts. There's really very little coverage, even if you tune into the World Service, of the impact of COVID on sub-Saharan Africa. But being part of our Christian solidarity with our brothers and sisters is that international fellowship, which does let us hear, I can think of myself over the last few weeks, it does let us hear and repeat stories and experiences of people in other parts of the world that might not be heard otherwise. And I'm sure a lot of us will have heard really quite moving accounts of the impact of COVID in some countries, which perhaps in the absence of testing infrastructure, I don't know, just doesn't seem to be reflected in the raw data. Finally, I would just urge us all to pray. You know, St. Paul in 1 Timothy bids us pray for those in authority. And I think that's something we do, speaking for myself, it's something I do often in a way that's too perfunctory. Over the last decade, political life, political discourse has got an awful lot coarser and more cynical. And I think we've all got a responsibility to change that. And we also might think about how we form and support Christians with a vocation in politics, nationally and locally. So huge number of subjects raised by this. Those are just some thoughts to get it started. Thank you.
Toby, thank you so much. I'm now going to bring Martin into the conversation. Martin, again, will you say a few words about who you are and your background, and then tell us about COVID and the common good? Thank you so much.
No problem. Good to be with you all today, and thank you to Toby. So I'm Martin Gainsborough, chaplain to the Bishop of Bristol. I've spent a lot of my working life alongside being ordained in the university. I was professor of development politics, so the politics of international development. So I've studied politics before I studied theology. I don't know what that says, but that's reality. I also served in in a parish in East Bristol, in Barton Hill, for a number of years, so in a city, Bristol. I'll press on at this point. I've been fascinated to know what Toby was going to say, particularly coming second. Was he going to steal all my thunder? And now I know. I think what I'm going to say should complement what Toby has said. I particularly am interested in, when one thinks about issues of the common good, how in the end one relates it to everyday practices, whether that of the local church, whether that's in the parish, chaplaincies, or in schools. So I'm probably going to say slightly less about public policy than Toby did. But as I say, I'm really interested in boiling it down to that sort of that local reality, what this means for the local church. My structure of what I'm going to say is fairly simple. I'm going to just a few introductory remarks. Then I'm going to offer some reflections on the common good. Then I'm going to offer some reflections on COVID, and you'll see how some of what I'm going to say overlaps with Toby. And then I want to put it all together, looking forward, and particularly looking forward for what this means for the local church. So in terms of some preliminaries and some caveats. So the first thing is, I see what we're dealing with, what we're thinking about here is COVID and the common good as a missiological question. It's ultimately about the mission, God's mission. And I also see it as an ecclesiological question. It's about the church and God's mission, and how we understand the role of the church. That's probably going to be more implicit than explicit in what I say, but I mention it nevertheless. The next point I want to make by way of a sort of introductory one is the fact that we are still living through the pandemic. And I want to acknowledge that in two ways. Firstly, that the impact of the pandemic is still very alive, and it's very raw, and deeply conscious of the loss that has come through the pandemic on a whole range of fronts. And I just want to acknowledge that insofar as if my presentation is quite analytical, I don't miss that point. The second thing about the fact we're still living through the pandemic is it raises questions in our mind about how much perspective we can actually have on this topic. You know, when things are quote unquote back to normal, whatever that means, the experience of the last year may feel different, may look different, we may see different things, and so I'm conscious of that. And then the last just introductory comment is I'm conscious that not only am I a white male reflecting on this subject, I'm a fairly prosperous, fairly privileged white male. And it doesn't mean that I can't be attentive to the experiences of others, but I am conscious of what my own experiences are and what they're not. We did very early on in the pandemic, some of you may remember, Bishop Viv asked us to reflect on 3 questions. I forget all 3 now, but 2 of them were, what have you learned and what have you lost, I think. And it was very striking getting the replies back, which were very beautiful and moving and insightful. But one of our reflections of those was we wondered if it sounded like the voice of a middle-class church. And we needed then to take further steps to listen more carefully to people whose experience was different. So I just mentioned that to be mindful of things I might leave out. So moving on to thinking about this idea of the common good. It's clearly a much bandied about term. It trips off the tongue very easily. It's often very poorly defined, or we don't articulate what we mean by it. As Toby says, we know it comes particularly rooted in Catholic social teaching, but there's also a growing body of literature by Anglicans reflecting on what would an Anglican take on this be, and you know, there's lots of huge amounts that we would, as Anglicans, agree with in terms of this coming from the Catholic Church. I'm not going to go into that. I want to first just say what the common good is not. It's not the greatest possible good for the greatest possible number. If you or I, if we were really kind of enlightened and really careful, we could come up with a sort of blueprint that would be just about the best for everyone. That's not what it is. The common good is God's good. It's about God's end and God's telos. And that's just a nice quote that I have here, just like to share with you. The common good is not some utilitarian calculus of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, nor is it some this worldly utopian social scheme. The common good is God. It is achieved through ordering all actions with his divine governance and providence, each thing in its own proper place, with its own proper significance. So the common good is God's good, which in one sense is a great relief, isn't down to us working it out. But on the other hand, this throws up some challenges. How on earth do we discern what God's good is? How do we avoid it being tainted by our own particular political or other perspectives? And I think the point to make here, just sort of in passing, that is that as we strive towards the common good, this is necessarily about discernment, with all that that means about carefulness, prayerful attentiveness, listening to others, waiting on God, waiting to be shown. So that's the first point about what the common good is. Another point I want to make about common good is in one sense, superficially, this will sound really obvious. The common good believes that there are goods in common. As I say, that might sound like really obvious, but actually it's worth pausing on that. It's actually very radical and very countercultural in relation to the sort of dominant political philosophy that underpins public life. A philosophy we're kind of political liberalism, a philosophy we're kind of not quite aware of its effects. Liberalism, liberal political culture, argues that actually it's founded on the basis that it believes we can't strive towards goods in common, either because we're too selfish and liable to disagree, or because we're just too different. Society is just too different, and it's to deal with that. It emphasizes the importance of upholding the freedom of the individual, the liberty of the individual. It says we can't find or strive towards goods in common, but if you maintain and uphold the freedom of the individual, you'll work out something that might be worth having. So it's much more focused on procedure. It's not about political liberalism. It's not about naming goods in common or believing that there are goods in common that for all humanity ring true. So common good thinking, and I think our scriptures bear this out, is very radical and countercultural. And then just lastly, just three kind of areas around which we might say that common good thinking sort of focuses on. The first being the foundational theological principle of the dignity of the human person created in the image of God. So what is it to be human? Toby touched on that. Secondly, common good thinking thinks about ideas about solidarity with others, particularly the weakest, rejection of exploitation and oppression. And thirdly, common good thinking emphasizes this notion of subsidiarity and the importance of intermediate institutions. So subsidiarity being the assertion that it's much better if decisions are made as close to the point at which they'll be impacted. And the point about intermediate institutions is common good thinking emphasizes the real importance of having social groups, ways in which people come together independent of the state, that operate between the individual and the state. And it's quite interesting if we think about subsidiarity and Anglicanism, because actually built into our polity with our parochial system, our parish system, our devolved system, there's a kind of built-in subsidiarity with local decision makings being made at the parish level. So that's some reflections on the common good. I want to move on now to talk about some thoughts about COVID. And like Toby, I also take the view, clearly we're living through a profound experience, which is having an impact on all of us. But like Toby, I don't think that COVID is telling us anything or very much that we didn't know already. But what it is doing is emphasizing certain things that we probably half knew or was semi in denial about. And that's really important. So even if I'm saying it's not teaching us anything remarkably new, that it's emphasizing certain things and allowing us to see things more clearly, I think is very important indeed. So I've got 3 points I want to make, and it's not comprehensive and you can add to them, but these were 3 things that struck me. Firstly, the pandemic has, I think, reinforced a sense of the fragility of our lives. And hopefully as people of faith, we know that, but it's been reinforced by the pandemic. But more than that, the pandemic has reinforced a sense of the fragility of our civilization. Now, again, if you look around the world, people living in poverty, civilization feels pretty fragile most of the time. But in the relatively prosperous global north, I think it's true to say that it's reinforced a sense of the fragility of our civilization. Yes, science is stepping into the breach with vaccines and so on and so forth, but the pandemic has brought much of normal life to a standstill, which is quite remarkable, really. Sophisticated, technologically advanced us have been kind of reduced to a standstill. Maybe we're not Lord and Master of all. And again, a theological perspective would say, no, we're not, but it's kind of the way in which the pandemic is reinforcing that. Secondly, I want to say something about the pandemic and technology and what we're learning through technology about ourselves. And again, one could qualify this, for people who have no access to technology, but leave that aside for a second. I think we're learning something very special and important through our use of technology through these days. How much you don't like gathering on Zoom, it has enabled us to do certain things, meeting today, for example. But it's also, I think, in a really interesting way, highlighted something profound about what it is to be human, and hence the limitations of technology. I don't know if you've had that experience where if you've been meeting someone on Zoom very regularly, and then for the first time you meet them in the flesh, you kind of want to touch them, you want to prod them. You're conscious of their bodiliness. You're conscious. It is reinforcing our sense of our physicality. And again, the church and theology has long said something about the importance of the body. So technology helps us, but it only helps us so much. It neglects the importance of our physicality, our bodiliness, and I think this is helpful and interesting going forward, in that there are always people in society who think that technology will solve everything. Maybe one of the things that the pandemic is doing is reminding us of the limitations of technology, push back to rather clumsily referred to as techno-solutionism. Pandemic is perhaps helping us there. And the third area I want to focus on in terms of what the pandemic is showing us, reinforcing to us, not entirely new, of course, but reinforcing to us, is around inequality. We're seeing more clearly the unequalness of our society and our world through the pandemic. In Bristol, saw a report recently which says how the COVID infection and death rates map almost perfectly onto indicators of poverty and deprivation. And we can understand some of the reasons for that, distinctions between the kind of jobs people have, inability to work from home, the kind of transport that people are required to use, using public transport, types of housing people have, whether that's living in closer proximity or having to use public lifts. And we know how the pandemic is reinforcing existing health inequalities. And then, of course, we've seen how the pandemic has impacted adversely BAME populations. And some of that has to do with poverty and deprivation, but there may be other factors as well. issues of inequality, as Toby touched on briefly, are flagged, highlighted around vaccine nationalism. We might want to talk more about that. And then there's something quite interesting, again, I'll just touch very briefly about some of the discourse around key workers that we've seen through the pandemic. On the one hand, positively, there's been a kind of an air of honouring, appreciating key workers, people doing particular kinds of jobs. But I would raise a question about how far that really has gone in terms of substantive change. So just pulling it all together, some final thoughts. As I said at the beginning, I'm interested in what any of this means for our practice, our everyday practices in the local church, parish, chaplaincy, school level. I think the three areas that I focused on, the fragility of our existence and our civilization, sort of technology and our physicality, something about emphasizing the physicality of our humanness, and the points I've been making about inequality. I think they already map quite well onto a sort of common good approach. There's something implicit in what I say about what it is to be human, the dignity of the human. There's something also about solidarity. My focus on thinking about the weakest in society, the unacceptableness of inequality. And there's perhaps something also about subsidiarity and the importance of intermediate institutions. COVID, I think we can say, has brought out the best and the worst in people. We've seen people trying to take advantage of other people in the wake of the pandemic, but also we've seen the best of people in terms of the richness of some forms of association, some communities to come in together. One of the things I want to just reflect on briefly before I finish is I've emphasized what the pandemic has enabled us to see more clearly. But I also want to just say something about what I think the pandemic may be distracting us from, because I think that's important when we think about the future. I wonder whether, in a small way, the pandemic is distracting us from the extent of our divisions as a society and the extent of our inability to get on well with people who are different from ourselves. We saw a lot of that around the time of Brexit. And I have a sense in which, as we've been preoccupied with the pandemic, yes, the pandemic has revealed and more clearly deep-seated inequalities, but I wonder if it's distracting us from our ability to solve problems when we disagree, to deliberate together. So when I think about the common good, COVID and the common good and the future, I want to say something about reconciliation and our ability as a church, as the local church, to step into that breach of aiding communities to work out their disagreements better, work through their disagreements better. And this is about striving to a future which is neither mine nor yours. It's a future that neither of us can imagine, but will be better than what we can imagine. And I think that the church has a important role in trying to encourage that, difficult though it is. Just a final, if you like, framework for how we might do that ability to transcend different, to bring communities together, to create something that's better than anything we can imagine, which is God's good, the common good. It's a framework which draws on Rowan Williams, and it says, first of all, the important thing we have to do is to recognize and honor difference. That's the first thing. And then it talks about dispossession. The second thing, we have to contemplate giving up our narrow practices of self-assertion, what I want or what you want. We have to be willing to give that up, dispossession. And then the third sort of point in this three-point framework is we have to commit to negotiating goods, the common goods, public goods, right ordering community with those people from whom we are different. That might feel in some ways quite abstract, but I think we could usefully apply it to everything that we do in our daily lives, out in our communities, the stuff that makes up everyday church life. And in some ways that's to speak about a sort of Christian politics, but it's also just to emphasize that I think one of the key roles for the church to do against prevailing culture often is to keep asserting that there are things that we have in common as human beings. Thank you.
Martin and Toby, can I say a huge thank you to you both for your contribution. I'm just going to bring Toby back into the spotlight. There we go. I mean, you've both given us a huge amount to chew on. I suppose my first question I want to ask you both comes out of what Martin's just ended with, but it might equally be where you started, Toby, because in some senses you started in a rather depressing place with the survey that said that essentially nothing's changed in the way people think as a result of all of this. So if there is such a thing as the common good to which Christians are to be working for and with others for, how do we share that in a political system and in a society perhaps that doesn't have a good sense of the common good? How do we actually go about saying that there is such a thing as a common good?
Shall I come in? I mean, I think we need to start. All of these conversations need to start at a very local level, which is why I mentioned some of that stuff about civic renewal. And I think something like the British Social Attitudes Survey, which asks people about, say, welfare claimants in general, elicits a very different response than talking about people you know, who are your next door neighbours, people with whom you're connected. And I think we're not going to very easily get back to a national sense of these common goods without having something more lively at perhaps a very local level. The church very clearly has a role there. We need to be confident about talking about these things. We need to have the vocabulary to do that. We need to make sure we're supporting each other, that we're drawing on the richness, as Martin rightly says, the countercultural message that we have, the interesting message that we have. And perhaps a lot of people in our churches don't actually realize the church has anything interesting to say here, and that's all of our responsibility.
I mean, I wonder, Toby, whether there's actually something about we need to make sure that we're meeting these people so that we're not talking about statistics, we're talking about human beings. And
there's been a lot of work, certainly in the States. There was a piece quite recently about the importance of local newspapers and how an increase in political cynicism and in things like conspiracy theories, because of a decline in local news, news that affects people's day-to-day lives. If people are getting all of their news through Facebook or Twitter about amorphous groups in society rather than about their neighbours, and I suppose there is perhaps something for local churches to think about there in a situation where we're living in a society where much of that local political infrastructure that past generations might have taken for granted is disappearing.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. Clearly, there's no magic bullet here, is there? And I think Toby and I maybe focus on slightly different things at different points in our talk, but I think we're both in agreement. I agree with what Toby's just said around the importance of if your question, Simon, was about how do we go about sharing a sense of the common good in a society which may be skeptical there is such a thing. And I think for me, like Toby, it's about boiling it down to our everyday practices. And it's kind of, if you're running projects in the local church, it's in their design and implementation. I think if we have a greater sense of common good thinking, one thing we might do is think through the ways in which our projects are purposefully set up to try and emphasize the things that common good thinking is emphasized are important. How do we strive towards a deep sense of human dignity, a sense of people being more than just individuals, something richer? How do we make that be sort of there and present and part of our thinking in terms of our projects and our everyday gatherings? I think it's, for me, since I've been doing reading about some of the limitations of political liberalism, and as I highlighted in my talk, the contrast between a common good perspective and a politically liberal perspective. I'm now fascinated as I prepare sermons to see ways in which Scripture speaks in the direction of the common good, speaks away from a sort of a liberal perspective on individuals and how you achieve the good society. So I think there's quite micro ways in which we can come at it. And I've done quite a lot of work in my time at a high level, at a sort of governmental level. And there's a place for that, definitely. How do we influence our governments and our MPs and so on? But I having done that, having had that experience, I am much more taken with the difference that we can try and make in small communities. And just one other point I wanted to make in terms of people might hear what Toby and I said about the pandemic not having told us very much that we don't already know. They might hear that as nothing has changed. But I think our position is probably more subtle than that, because I think what the pandemic is doing is helping us to see things more clearly. And we could easily just lapse back into not seeing them anymore. But the pandemic gives us an opportunity, because we've seen some things more clearly. They've been reinforced, and perhaps we've reacted we don't want it to be like that. And I think the whole key worker debate is very interesting. I think it has revealed something very important about how we value or don't value people who do certain kinds of jobs. That's a really precious insight, which we hope we can build on and learn from, and the local church can help us build on and learn from. But we could easily just say, oh yeah, that was then, and we move on and we return to how things were before. But it's not. I don't think either of us is saying that nothing has changed.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think the time has come for us to move into some breakout groups. So I'm going to organise that. And some questions to think on whilst we're in some groups would be, what do you see locally that connects with what Toby and Martin have said? So what do you see locally that connects? How is the church, and perhaps also how should the church be engaging with questions of the common good? And then as a group, do you have one question that you want to just pursue a bit more? So one question for further discussion. How's that? I think we'll have about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and see what some of those questions provoke. I will put those questions into the chat within the group, so I'll wait for folk to to get into groups. Let's do some signing. That's what Martin was saying about technology is right. Right. That should be it.
It's a very complicated process. I'm glad you were doing.
Well done.
I'm sure I've made it more complicated than I needed to. But there we go.
I find putting just the area deans into breakout rooms stresses me out. So 50 odd people from. Thank you for what you shared, Toby.
Thank you, Martin, for what you. Yeah, that was really rich. What you said. I've got lovely notes from what you said, which I will.
Yeah, I do reflect often on my experience of kind of doing consultancy around international aid and working with the UN or DIF and so on. And it was really interesting, and you can make a difference, but often I felt you were just, the obstacles to making a difference were so huge. It has kind of pushed me in the direction of actually really enjoying the local and what you do at a grassroots level, which the church is hugely well set up for. It's it's what we do, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think being in a parish full time is an amazingly privileged position to be in, actually.
And it's not that there aren't frustrations, but some of those frustrations of working at a high level, that meta level.
Yeah.
There are other kinds of frustrations, I suppose, but yeah. It did slightly, working for the UN for a period did sort of send me scurrying for small grassroots stuff.
Where were you doing that? Were you in New York or?
I was doing that I had a secondment when I was at Bristol University to the United Nations Development Programme in some years ago now, 2005, 2006, and I was in Hanoi.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, which was very rich experience.
Do either of you have texts that you'd be prepared to? So welcome back, folks. Can I ask people to put in chat the questions that they've been coming up with in groups? And I'm just going to bring, if I can find him, Bishop Lee in. Who seems to have disappeared. Oh, there. Oh, he was waving there. I found him. Sorry, Bishop Lee. You wanted to say something about the dignity of the human person.
Yeah, thanks first of all both to you, Toby and Martin, for your input. Really, really good. It was around the mention of technology and the value of people, and it just two things came to mind. The first thing is that paradoxically, we really do value the things that only can be done by human beings at the very bottom. So if you're a care home worker, actually, we need people there. AI is not going to hack it. Nursery children, you know, the youngest of the youngest, you're not going to be able to do that with automation. But actually, we pay peanuts for that. So there's this paradoxical thing that technology, which we're trying to get to do so much for us, there are things technology just cannot do, and human beings must do them, but they are not valued. And the second point around value and human beings relates to what, you know, some people may know about David Goodhart's work in talking about people who are somewhere people, and they're kind of rooted in a particular place. And actually, Swindon's got lots of those. It's a kind of place that people tend to get rooted. The anywhere people are the ones who go off to a university somewhere else and then don't come back. And there are organizations in Swindon that are working carefully to try and make sure they can thrive and then go back. But the interesting thing that David Goodhart is talking about now is that we are overvaluing certain things about human beings, particular cognitive gifting. And we were talking about the diversity, you know, the fact that we've got division. And one of those divisions is around, you know, am I valued? I'm doing a manual job, which actually is pretty critical. It goes back to the key worker thing. But people are not valued for that. You've only made it if you've been to university and got certain degrees. And the truth is that more and more people are coming out of university with degrees. So now it's looking for those who have particular cognitive gifts. Maybe they're going to be potential people to make AI. So I think there's a whole really interesting take on what our society is valuing and where that is being spotted by people who are not being valued and therefore being alienated.
Thank you, Bishop. I'm going to remove your spotlight for now.
I don't mind not being in the spotlight. I'm in it a bit too much, to be honest.
There we go. There are lots of really interesting questions going on in chat. I don't know if any have struck you, Toby, Martin. One that struck me was a question about support for grieving for the common good.
One of the questions which strikes me, sorry not to answer the grieving one, I don't quite know how to answer that one, but one of the questions is, given how focused people have become on the household, how are we going to get the church looking outward to the common good? I do think it's very important to say that in the church's teaching about the common good, the family unit is a really important unit. So the household's households do matter when it comes to the common good. I think when it comes to subsidiarity again, it's important to say that part of subsidiarity is the idea you shouldn't withdraw from individuals and commit to the community what individuals can accomplish through their own enterprise and industry. So pushing back a little bit from what Martin was saying about political liberalism, there is also a sense in which individuals and families are at least part of the mix when it comes to common good. So I wouldn't necessarily see the household simply as an obstacle to be overcome. It is a constituent part of how we live, a very important one. I suppose the question then is about how to make those household units more outward looking rather than more insular. Yeah, so that's a contribution to that question.
Just a couple of things. I will try and say something about support for grieving for the common good, and it would ideally be good to hear reflections from the questioner, but that might be a bridge too far technologically. But just going back to some of what Bishop Lee was saying, I've been taken. I don't know this writing intimately, but I've been taken with some writing which sort of starts to say, when we think about work, that all kinds of work, even the stuff we would tend to think of lowly or menial, that a good way to think about it is I suppose through the lens of learning a craft and a vocation and apprenticeship, and I like that kind of language because it says that whatever kind of work you're doing, there is something about learning how to do it well and take pride in that. So I think it helps us see quote unquote menial jobs differently. However, I think there's still a huge problem, because you can end up feel you're just paying lip service to that kind of language of learning a craft and so on. If we pay people very poorly, and so I think that feeds us into the tricky, thorny issue about the huge discrepancy in kind of wages and wage differentials. And I think, ideally, if we were serious about addressing the way in which certain jobs have historically been looked down upon and paid poorly, we'd have to address the wage issue, and that's a conundrum if ever there was one. Support for grieving for the common good. The only thing that I just share a sort of anecdote. All through the pandemic, the Mayor of Bristol has been saying to the faith communities, churches, but broader than churches, other faiths as well, what are you going to do to help us grieve, to help us remember, to mark grief and loss? So I think there's something about the need for some collective coming together around this. That's really difficult at the moment because we can't gather physically. And in the work that I'm involved in the city of Bristol, we've fallen back on trying to put together a film where people share something of their story, reflect on grief and loss as an offering to the city. But it feels not quite hitting the spot, because actually what we need to do is come together physically, be together and lament and share our stories to grieve and to try and look forward in hope. I don't know if that's at all helpful to your question.
I think that shared sense of lament is very important. It may simply have to wait, and we have to remember it. I mean, I'm like a lot of parish clergy doing lots of funerals where really it's only the family there, and huge chunks of civil society links are then cut out of the funeral, and a sense of collective lament and grief and prayer is important. I think coming back, Martin, to some of what you were saying about the theology of labour and craft, I think there is a danger in some theology looking at the theology of manual work, that it can tend to romanticize it.
Yeah.
And I think part of what we have to say as Christians is actually parts of life are boring and involve drudgery, and we have to also look to everything outside of work to give joy and meaning. There are wonderful examples of that, obviously, here in Swindon with things like the Mechanics Institution, lots of grassroots organisations that grew up. The debate whether it was paternalistically provided through the GWR or whether it was actually something that sprang up from the workers themselves. But all of those structures, I think, are very important. There are some questions, aren't there, about to what extent does what people are paid reflect how they are valued, and even if we can't sort out differentials in pay, can we sort out how we talk about and value and honour people in society?
Yeah.
Labour peer Maurice Glassman has said recently that he's got a new definition of what it is to be working class, and to be working class is to be unable to work from home. I think we've got time to look at one more of the variety of questions. There's one about how schools might get involved. There's one around how do we keep momentum going and not return to default norms? I don't know which one of those or others resonate with the two of you.
I suppose when it comes to schools, there is something I find it very unsettling going to schools and seeing those posters about British values that they have. And if we were to come up with posters of civic values from a Christian perspective, how would our posters differ from those, I think, very un-British posters of British values? That might be an exercise for local churches to do. It's something for us to discuss locally when we go into churches as clergy, when we go into schools as clergy. How do we talk about these things?
Yeah. How does one work in schools? I think any of these kind of questions about different contexts and how one works. I think the thing is you've got to journey with people, haven't you? And you've got to build the relationships and get to know people really quite well, and only then can you start to see, oh, that's interesting. They're tending to emphasize this particular thing, and maybe we're getting stuck on this particular thing. Is there some work we can do together, some kind of intervention where we might, almost implicitly sort of bring a distinct theological principle to bear? You wouldn't use that language, would you? But it would be implicit in your thinking, in your design of activity. But again, it's these things are only possible through time-consuming journeying with people over time. I'm concerned very much about it seems more likely than not that we will struggle to learn some of the things we're learning through the pandemic, and we revert to how things were before. I don't have a good answer to how we prevent that, except to say we need to, all of us, note down the unique insights that we're getting and somehow build them into our everyday practice and the conversations we have, whether at a high level or at a low level. And that's, for all of us, it's so easy you know, when we emerge from this period, whatever that looks like, it's so easy. Our tendency will be to default.
Maybe on our very empty calendars, we should, in a year or 2 years, put in the diary a date to reflect post COVID on all of this, and not simply to be getting on with life again, which I suspect we may do. I know a lot of people are sort of sneer at the idea of getting back to whatever is normal. I mean, I suspect we will get back to something that looks quite normal, and this will then look like an interlude, which is why we can't trust that any of the positive change we might want to come out of this will happen automatically. It won't. It's up to us.
No, you can see how around meetings, that the way we meet in future will not, I don't think, will be the same post-COVID as pre-COVID, but we're going to long for gathering physically, but we won't always leap in the car now and drive down the motorway in the way we used to, where we think that's okay, where we think we can. So some things I think will change, but perhaps some of them, almost the more important things, which have to do with inequality, lack of opportunity in life, poor life chances. I think those are the areas where we run the risk of failing to learn lessons and bring about the change.
And I think, although there is loads of really good stuff still in chat, I think this is the point at which we have to draw some stumps. We ended talking about learning lessons, and just prior to that, Martin was urging us to kind of notice things, almost kind of to journal what we're going through, and added to Toby's suggestion at the end of his introductory talk that we should pray. So I think let's take a moment and pray together. Let's pray for our political leaders, nationally and locally. Let's pray for our neighbours and for those around us. Let's pray for those who are in need, who are suffering, who lack food or healthcare or work or adequate housing. Prayer of St. Augustine set for today's prayer for the day. Eternal God, the light of the minds that know you, the joy of the hearts that love you, and the strength of the wills that serve you. Grant us so to know you that we may truly love you, so to love you that we may truly serve you, whose service is perfect freedom. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Some thank yous to end with. Can I thank everyone for their time and their energy and engagement? That's been brilliant, and I do wish we had more time to engage with what's in chat. So thank you for all for that. And a huge thank you to Toby and to Martin for all that they've given us. Really rich food for thought and prayer. Perhaps we could unmute and give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Simon, might you save the chat? Can you do that? You can do it. I don't know. Do you know how to do it?
You might have to tell me when we're done.
It's the three buttons at the bottom.
3 dots. Just
3 dots. You say, and then it lets you save chat. And then you save
it does. It is
good to see that.
So I have saved the chat. And one last thing, which is the next kind of CMD event for everyone to advertise, which is on Wednesday, the 17th of March in the evening. And it's a look at a book. It's called Rewilding the Church by Steve Aisthorpe. Bishop Viv used the phrase rewilding the church in her last Diocesan Synod address, which is really what's inspired this. So if you're interested in that, do get a hold of a copy of the book and book into the reading group on Wednesday, the 17th of March in the evening via Eventbrite and the website and the normal places. Let me say thank you again to Martin and to Toby, and thank you to everyone for being here. Go well, and hopefully see you soon.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye
you.
all.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Come on.